In a flash of gunpowder, a giant explodes onto the stage of history. Battling centuries of ignorance and isolation, he drags millions out of the Dark Ages and forges a new nation. His tactics are knowledge and fear. His strategy, to propel ancient Russia into the modern world and emblazon his name, Peter the Great. On the vast and desolate plains of Russia, time has little meaning. A new age, the 18th century, is about to dawn, but Russia is frozen in time, and progress stands still. Elsewhere, great nations are rising. Holland is building the world's largest empire. Sweden is amassing an invincible army. But for the Russian people born to this giant land, Europe is a distant horizon, beyond their imagination. Still, 1682 is destined to be a year like no other, a year that will force the hand of time to move the Russian clock forward. It marks the beginning of an extraordinary rise to power. The rise of Tsar Peter. A towering 6 feet 7 inches tall, Peter will make equally colossal changes to bring Russia in line with the rest of Europe, but the task will not be easy. A nation of 8 million peasants, Russia is a relic of the Dark Ages. Economically, politically, and technologically, it is the most backward nation in Europe. Isolated from the outside world, the Byzantine domes of the Kremlin reflect centuries of resistance to progress and reform. The palace of the ruling Romanovs stands a resolute symbol of the unshakable domination of the Tsars. They hold the power of life and death over millions. Their will is law. But even in Russia's long memory, one ruler's drive for power is exceptional. The reign of Sophia Romanov began as it would end in bloodshed. In 1682, the reigning Tsar died, leaving 2 young heirs. Sophia seized the initiative. With a cocktail of lies and promises, she induced the palace guards, known as the Streltsy, to storm the Kremlin and seize control. Dragged from their beds and hounded like animals, Sophia's enemies are mercilessly butchered. Some members of the royal family were even impaled. Two witnesses to the brutality are Sophia's stepmother, Natalia, and her son, Peter. The 10-year-old Peter is the object of Sophia's wrath. The other possible heir is Ivan, who at 16 has a better claim on the throne, but his health is frail and his mind is locked in a simple, childish state. With one too young and one too feeble, an unusual decision is made. They will share the crown with Sophia as regent. In a unique joint ceremony, the 2 young Tsars-in-waiting were anointed. But the clock was already ticking on Sophia's regime. The only way power could be permanently hers was if either of the boys failed to become Tsar. Ivan posed small threat. his mind would never mature. But Peter was different. A healthy child with an active mind. Even at this young age, he stood tall. Manhood was clearly just a few years away. Natalia knew well the depths of Sophia's resolve, and swiftly removed her son from the danger that lurked in the Kremlin. She took him to an estate outside Moscow. But if Sophia was pleased by Peter's self-imposed exile, it was a disastrous miscalculation. He was not a boy in hiding. He was a czar in the making. The country proved a powerful testing ground for the young Peter. He determined to turn himself into a soldier, a one-man fighting machine. By the age of 11, he could fire a cannon. At 13, he was handling pistols and muskets. Many of his tutors were foreign officers living in a nearby German enclave. With their help, he recruited 600 boys and turned them into a well-disciplined army. He even staged war games, using real weapons and ammunition. In one, 20 soldiers were killed. To create a truly professional army, not one based on tradition, Peter assumed the role of the drummer boy. He believed that rank should be based on merit and experience, not on nobility. Each new display of talent and maturity sent a stab of fear through Sophia's heart. In her eyes, Peter was a serpent's egg. How long before he hatched? In 1689, Sophia could stand no more. 7 years after taking power, her obsession with Peter erupted into paranoia. She was convinced he was leading a rebellion against her, and in a chilling echo of her original coup, she called out the palace guard. Peter woke in the early hours to the nightmare that scarred his boyhood, the guards marching against him. But that was 7 years ago. Then he was just a boy. Now he was the anointed Tsar. No palace guard had the courage to touch the embodiment of God on earth. Sophia might have the throne, but Peter had divine right. The guards abandoned Sophia. Peter had not been planning a coup, but now that he had the opportunity to get rid of Sophia, he grabbed it. He was fond of Ivan and protected him. But Sophia had to be punished. She was banished to a convent outside Moscow. She would never leave. Peter stood supreme. The way was clear to begin a new chapter in Russia's history. Within a year of taking power, Peter took a wife. Named Yevdokia, she was shy and uneducated, but she proved a dutiful wife and bore him a son. He had a family. He had an heir. He had put his house in order. Now Peter faced a new challenge. Soon he would turn his back on 1,000 years of Russian tradition and carve from the vast and rugged reaches of the East a new and powerful empire. Whoever occupied the throne of the Tsars had great power. But in Russia, nature was king. A land of breathtaking mountains, of vast lakes and enormous rivers. Much of it lay unexplored. The country overflowed with waterways winding to the sea. In the entire nation, there's not one canal. Endless forests of pine and birch created barriers to commerce and communication. The boundaries of Russia stretched from the icy borders of Sweden through the wilds of the Orient to the very edge of the Pacific Ocean. Throughout the land, the Tsar could, at will, make laws, impose taxes, and change customs centuries old. Of the 8 million people born to this unforgiving soil, 95% were serfs, enslaved to grinding poverty and harsh physical labor. Without end, without mercy, theirs was a life with little dignity and less humanity. Even the wealth of the powerful landowners brought them little culture. The rest of the world was so far away, they looked only inwards. And the knowledge that did reach them was slow to come. Russia's overpowering landscape challenged any who attempted to cross it. Roads were little more than tracks. Those who dared fought an unending battle with stultifying mud. Even in the towns there was little sophistication. Houses were built of wood, with unkempt sidewalks, thick with dust in summer and awash in mud in winter. Progress was pitiful. The peasants had no learning, few tools, and no vision of the future. They lived off the meager food the land gave up, and every morsel had to be hacked from the tired soil. Half of all children never survived their first year. Men were lucky to reach 40. Russia's chief source of power remained muscle, and people were the greatest commodity. This is the Russia Peter inherits, a country where people are locked in and change kept out. Only one place was different. Just 3 miles outside Moscow, a prosperous enclave of splendid stone houses identified the so-called German suburb, where most foreigners were consigned to live. Here buildings were light and modern, tall and straight. They had been constructed using the latest designs and technology. And technology was what Peter craved. Out of the German suburb came the most ingenious instruments. For Peter, they were both fascinating and frustrating. No one at his court could understand such confusing hoops of metal. But then the suburbs surrendered their greatest gift, a man with the power to explain. Dutch merchant Franz Timmerman brought the technology to life. He revealed the secret of a sextant, a device for mastering distances at sea. It could turn tides, winds, and waves into powerful allies. Timmerman filled Peter with dreams of the sea, and the Tsar never looked back. Because Moscow was so far from the coast, no Tsar had called for a navy. No Tsar had waged war at sea, but Peter was like no other Tsar. If the rest of Europe was mastering the waves, then so would he. He would break free from a landlocked Moscow. In the company of Timmerman, Peter came across an abandoned English boat. Its design and construction fed an already raging curiosity. Timmerman showed him how it was built to sail against the wind and turn into the waves. It was not long before Peter decided to build a fleet of his own. He would take his army to sea. Peter orders 5 ships to be built on a lake 85 miles from Moscow, the nearest large body of water. He taught himself the skills of woodworking and labored hard under the guidance of European craftsmen. He took pride in what he learned, and even left his mark. 4 years later, in the summer of 1693, he traveled 600 miles to Archangel. High on the northern coast, this town became the focus of Peter's attention for one reason only. It had a port. For the first time in his life, Peter glimpsed the sea. Here he would build a base and launch his navy. Only 130 miles from the Arctic Circle, Archangel is icebound for 6 months of the year. But now, in the summer months, the thaw came, and Peter could fulfill a long-held ambition. Aboard his yacht, the St. Peter, he escorted a convoy of Dutch and English merchant ships bound for Europe. He led them through the White Sea to the edge of the Arctic Ocean. Only then did he reluctantly turn back. Yet the journey is a triumph. Peter is the first Tsar to go to sea. On this day he has charted a new course for Russia. But Russia has no desire to change course. Behind him is his empire, bound up within the walls of the hated Kremlin. His duty pulled him back to the suffocating life in Moscow. To lessen the onerous burden of the court, Peter kept company with men who knew the pleasures and excitement of the wider world. Many of them were foreigners from the German suburb, officers who trained in his regiments, sea captains who thrilled Peter with tales of their voyages. They dined together regularly, from noon until dawn, sometimes longer. They drank themselves senseless on beer and vodka, and the Tsar drank the most. Peter was a hellraiser. He and his friends dubbed themselves the Jolly Company, an innocent guise for a group of drunken fools and cruel jokers. At a time when the church opposed any contact with foreigners, the Tsar was dressing like them, dining with them, and using them to run the country. To traditionalists, Peter was the devil, and the devil was about to ride. Each year, the terror of the Tartar horsemen descended on the people of the Ukraine. As spring turned to summer, they came to burn, pillage, and take prisoners. Those who escaped death were sold as slaves. The Tartars seemed unstoppable, but Peter had a plan. If he could seize the Turkish-held fortress town at Azov, he could deal a blow to their raids and gain a port on the Black Sea, the gateway to the Mediterranean and southern Europe. To this end, Peter marched an army of 150,000 men 500 miles south from Moscow. For 14 weeks, Peter bombarded Azov, sometimes loading the mortars with his own hands. But the attack was doomed from the beginning. Peter had broken the first rule of besieging a fortress: surround it and cut it off completely. Peter's earthworks failed to fully encircle Azov, which meant it could continue to receive supplies by sea. Without ships to block the harbor, Peter was helpless. As winter set in, he marched a demoralized army home to Moscow. But he took with him the lesson of Azov: master the water to win the war. His mind turned once again to building a navy. He ordered 25 armed galleys and 1,300 river barges, all to be constructed in 5 months. The fact that he had no shipyards or workforce and the temperatures were sub-zero was no obstacle. Peter simply built the shipyards first and drafted the labor. When spring bloomed, so did his navy. Peter sailed his fleet downriver to Azov and sealed it off from the sea. This time he built new earthworks, higher than the city walls. The bombardment was devastating. Peter's capture of Azov won him the admiration and respect of Europe. It also vindicated his passionate belief in the power of a navy. Russia had a new fighting force and a new hero. Peter was just 24 years old. His victory march into Moscow was several miles long, and it bore all the hallmarks of his personality. The crowds looked for their Tsar in vain. Horsemen with flags flying and generals in gilded carriages paraded through Moscow without Peter, it seems. But bringing up the rear, shoulder to shoulder with his men, was one who stood above the rest. Bombardier Sergeant Peter Romanov. Back in Moscow, time served its inevitable purpose, to set Peter's mind to thoughts of escape and travel. Europe still lay beyond his experience. Tales told by his foreign cohorts didn't satisfy his curiosity, but inflamed it. He must see it for himself. Peter set out on an extraordinary course of action. If a Tsar had left the borders of Russia before, it had been in the name of war. But now Peter was embarking on a different mission. He was going to plunder Europe for ideas, knowledge, and talented minds. In March 1697, he left Moscow. The pomp and ceremony was also left behind. Peter didn't travel as a monarch. He chose instead to travel anonymously, just one man among an entourage of 250 companions. Peter went first to the Baltic coast, to the Swedish-held city of Riga. Then his course turned southwards. A hurried journey through Berlin and Hanover brought him to his desired destination, the city he so desperately wanted to see, Amsterdam. Amsterdam is the richest city in the world, proof of the genius of the West. The city grew out of a swamp. By draining and damming, the Dutch held back the sea. The same feat of engineering was used to create homes the envy of Europe. Rows of houses bordered a network of canals that moved people and goods across the city. But the beauty of its architecture, the gentle sweep of its waterways, belied Amsterdam's strength. Riches from all corners of the world found their way into the homes and estates of Dutch merchants. The finest food, the greatest art. Wool, gold, spices, all came under the control of this tiny European state. The secret of Holland's wealth was its fleet of 4,000 trading ships, more than every other European country combined. With Dutch ships on every sea, Holland enjoyed a virtual monopoly on world trade. Peter knew that here he would uncover the secrets of shipbuilding. To study the craft, he hired hundreds of captains and sailors, shipwrights and pilots, and sent them back to Russia. He bought his own set of tools. No ordinary shipbuilder would treat the Tsar of Russia as just another apprentice, so Peter kept his identity a secret. He signed on as a carpenter in the name of Peter Mikhailov. His cover was nearly blown when he ran into a Dutch blacksmith he had worked with in Moscow. But the blacksmith played along and even organized suitably humble lodgings for him, squeezing Peter's 6.5-foot frame into 2 tiny rooms. To recruit doctors for Russia, Peter visited Dutch hospitals. He learned to dissect corpses and pull teeth. When his entourage was revolted by the sight of a cadaver, he made them all bite off a piece of muscle. When Peter discovered dentistry, his companions learned not to complain of a toothache. After 4 months, he completed his ship, the Peter and Paul. Before he left, a Dutch admiral staged a farewell party designed to appeal to the eccentric Tsar. A mock sea battle gave Peter a tantalizing taste of the thrills of naval warfare. But his memories would be of more than combat. He has seen the future, and now there's no turning back. At the invitation of King William III, he sailed for London, where England's finest architect, Sir Christopher Wren, was building St. Paul's Cathedral. He visited the Royal Observatory to consult with the astronomer, and borrowed ideas for coins and cannons from the King's Mint and Arsenal. Near the dockyards, Peter moved into the house of diarist John Evelyn, but the still rowdy and uncivilized Tsar and his friends wreck it. They smashed windows and furniture, destroyed floors and paintings, and flattened a 400-foot holly hedge by riding wheelbarrows through it. The damage wasn't discovered till Peter had left. Still, the grand tour has been historic. The great embassy headed across Europe, through Leipzig, Dresden, and Prague, to the court of the Emperor of Austria. No other could rival Vienna for its gaiety and splendor. A worldly and westernized Peter prepared to learn a new European art, the delights of high society. But while still 1,000 miles from Moscow, Peter receives chilling news. The palace guards are in revolt. He dashed home, stopping only to change horses. When he reached Krakow in Poland, he learned the rebellion was weakening. By the time the Tsar got back to Russia, 1,800 prisoners lay in chains. His generals informed him that the guards had rebelled against being sent away from Moscow to fight the Turks. But Peter was not satisfied that he was told the whole truth. Certain a larger plot lay behind the uprising, he would force the truth out by whatever means. Peter ordered 130 ringleaders executed. The rest faced cruel interrogation. The chief instrument was the knout, a hard leather whip 3.5 feet long. 20 strokes would tear the flesh down to the bone. More could be fatal. Then the raw back might be probed with red-hot irons, or slowly roasted on a spit. The guards were interrogated 6 days a week for 6 weeks, but Peter could find no evidence of a conspiracy. Still, he hanged hundreds of rebels from the Kremlin walls. In Red Square, hundreds more were branded, mutilated, or beheaded. 2 were skinned alive, 1 inch at a time. The Tsar killed 5 of the traitors with his own hands. Peter had a lingering suspicion that Sophia was again behind the revolt. At the convent where she was confined, he hanged another 200. 3 he suspected of being her lovers. They were killed directly outside her window. Their bodies hung there all winter. If Peter faced opposition from his fellow men, he was about to risk the wrath of an even greater foe, God and the Church. The Russian Church was the guardian of tradition. Life was governed by the toll of its bells. Although he was a conscientious churchgoer, Peter hated the Church's opposition to change. The very day he returned from the West, he challenged one of its basic beliefs. To shave was a mortal sin because it defaced the image of man created by God. But Peter, like most Westerners, was clean-shaven. As his courtiers greeted him after his lengthy absence, Peter suddenly produced scissors and cut their beards off, beginning with the commander of his army. At a banquet 2 months later, Peter drew out his scissors again and hacked off the traditional long sleeves of the boyars. "These things are in your way," he cried, and with a flash of the blade they were gone. European dress was enforced by decree, and anyone wanting to keep their beard had to pay a tax and wear a small bronze medallion stamped "Tax Paid." Although these actions spoke of a man bent on change, they paled against Peter's greater plan, to put Russia on the world map. At 28, the Tsar at last had a fleet, but nowhere to sail it. Azov had proved a disappointment, with the Turks constantly frustrating Russian access. So Peter looked west, towards Sweden. For 500 years, Russians and Swedes had disputed the territory surrounding the Baltic Sea. These lands promised access to Europe, and Peter determined to take them. In July 1700, he declared war on Sweden and marched his army towards the Baltic coast. But the Swedes were not intimidated. Peter's rival was a mere boy, only 18. Charles XII, like Peter, took the throne in childhood. He shared Peter's appetite for conflict and built one of the best armies in Europe. The Swedes meet the Russians at the coastal fortress of Narva. Charles's army is exhausted by the long march. It's also clear that they are vastly outnumbered. For each Swedish soldier, Peter has 4 Russians. But audacity is Charles's hallmark. He storms the Russian position. In the face of savage opposition, his daring pays off. Victory goes to Charles. Russia is now open to invasion. Even Moscow is vulnerable. To defend it, Peter has to rebuild his army and re-equip it. With no raw materials, he did the unthinkable. He took the bells from Russia's churches and melted them down. Peter would turn holy bronze into a hellish array of new weapons. For many, it was sacrilege, but to Peter, it was progress. He built cannon foundries, powder mills, and armories, textile mills to make uniforms, and leather works to make harnesses. The whole economy was geared for war. In the summer of 1701, Peter had a stroke of luck. Charles turned his attention from Russia to Poland, considered a more dangerous threat. The switch effectively left the smaller Baltic forts at Peter's mercy. For a single night in 1703, he bombarded the fortress at Nyenskans. It fell, and Peter had what he wanted, an outlet onto the Baltic. Peter felt triumphant. To celebrate, he announced that he would build a city. The land was wet and boggy, but fresh in Peter's memory were images of Amsterdam, built on a drained swamp. If the Dutch could do it, so could he. This new city would one day be his capital and a window on the West. For many of the Russians drafted to build it, they were laying more than foundations. They were digging their own graves. Overworked and underfed, they succumbed to scurvy, dysentery, and malaria. But in the face of progress, Peter put a low price on human life. This was a necessary sacrifice. With no tools, laborers had only their fear to drive them on. Those attempting to escape faced maiming and imprisonment. 30,000 would eventually die. St. Petersburg was built on mud and bones. Peter supervised, watching every stage of construction from a 3-room log cabin. He didn't see the death toll. He saw instead an emerging city with a fortress and a shipyard, a city from which he would launch his empire. Memories of Europe fired Peter's imagination. He recruited an architect named Domenico Trezzini. Trezzini fueled the flames of Peter's passion. Together they planned a city graced by noble avenues and a domed skyline. Trezzini filled Peter with a vision of a mighty cathedral. The envy of Europe, it would form the centerpiece of the new city. Peter agreed that work should begin immediately. But not everyone shared his vision. Russians were appalled at the spiraling cost in lives and money. When Peter ordered all the nobles in the land to build a fine stone house in distant St. Petersburg, the huge expense drained 2/3 of their wealth. Everything had to be imported, right down to the stones. Every arriving wagon and ship brought with it a fresh supply. Equally scarce were stonemasons. Peter remedied the problem with a new demand. No stone house will be built anywhere else in Russia. Stonemasons flocked to St. Petersburg. Another shortage was residents. As no Russian would willingly choose to live on a swamp, the Tsar invited his court to move to the capital, a perilous invitation to refuse. No one declined. The city was filled with the greatest musicians, writers, artists. This would be the city of the future, but even as the city was rising, danger loomed on the Baltic. St. Petersburg could yet be destroyed and returned to the sea. Another campaign was brewing. In 1708, the specter of Charles XII of Sweden returned to haunt Russia. He had unfinished business with Peter and was ready to invade. But Peter was ready too. If Charles thought he could pillage supplies for his soldiers on the way, he was mistaken. For over 100 miles in front of the Swedish army, Peter had cut a swath of desolation. Villages were depopulated and destroyed, food hidden. The devastation forced Charles to detour south into the Ukraine and away from Moscow. Peter continued his rampage. He ordered every house burned, every bridge wrecked, every field wasted. Wherever Charles turned, he found ruin. For Russia, no sacrifice was too great. Now Charles faced his cruelest enemy, the Russian winter. Snow covered the ground for 6 months. Trees died, birds dropped in mid-flight, and sentries froze at their posts. The Swedes were ravaged by hunger, cold, and Russian marauders. By spring, the young king had lost half his army. In 1709, the two armies converge at Poltava. Peter matches Charles' audacity with cunning. He lures him into attacking what looks like an undefended position. At the last moment, the Swedish king discovers it's heavily fortified. To put his plan into action, Peter orders the construction of a large square trench. Then he lines it with cannons and 40,000 infantry and cavalry. The tactic is risky, but Peter is determined to see it through. At dawn the next day, Russian cannons tear into the ranks of the Swedish infantry while they are still massing for attack. As the Swedes advance, their luck turns from bad to worse. Poor coordination among their generals leaves their main thrust outnumbered 5-1. More damaging is the absence of Charles. Wounded in the heel a few days before, he is unable to lead his troops. By midday, the victory is Peter's. Charles is forced to flee on a borrowed horse and seek shelter in Turkey. Never again would Sweden be strong enough to threaten Peter and Russia. Peter's final confrontation came not with a foreign monarch, but from within his own family. As a conqueror, he was unrivaled. As a father, he was a failure. His relationship with his son Alexis is cold and distant. Alexis is everything Peter is not: weak, pious, and conservative. Raised by his mother to love the church, he loathes and fears his father. Alexis consoles himself with religion and alcohol. Eventually, Peter delivers an ultimatum. Alexis must either make himself fit to rule or serve God as a monk. Alexis chooses a third option. He flees. He went to Vienna, then to Naples, where he hid. But Peter's ministers hunt him down and drag him back to face his father's wrath. To speak ill of the Tsar is treason. Peter grants mercy on two conditions. Alexis will keep his life, but lose his claim to the throne. And he must name names. If Peter's actions were extreme, it was because he suspected a deeper plot. He imprisoned his son in St. Petersburg, and nouts, executes, or exiles anyone who might have encouraged Alexis in his revolt. Months later, Peter learned that his son, after taking the throne, planned to sink the navy and abandon St. Petersburg. Again, Alexis is questioned. Under the threat of torture, he admits he told a priest he wished his father were dead and would have joined a revolt. His words seal his fate. Alexis is tried for treason and tortured. He receives 40 blows of the knout and is sentenced to death. It's said that Peter struck the first blow. In one final act of defiance, Alexis died, probably from the shock of the torture, before Peter could sign his death warrant. Life for Peter went on. The day after his son's death, he held a banquet to celebrate the 9th anniversary of his victory over Charles of Sweden. Peter indulged himself in style, but years of excessive drinking and a punishing workload had taken their toll. Once seemingly superhuman, Peter now looked dangerously mortal. But his reputation showed no signs of weakening. In 1721, the Russian Senate awarded Peter 3 new titles. In a grand ceremony, he is named Father of the Fatherland, Peter the Great, Emperor of Russia. The mold that made Peter, he had made himself. As a boy, he found the freedom to dream and the courage to dare. He had the vision to conceive great changes and the energy to carry them through. His reign was one of continuous territorial expansion. He waged war for 21 years, creating a modern army and Russia's first navy. He built harbors, fortresses, a new capital city. He changed the face of Russia forever. All this he did without borrowing a single gold piece from any man or nation. He achieved it with the sacrifice of his humblest subjects, and ultimately of himself. In 1723, Peter was struck down by a chronic bladder infection and underwent an excruciating operation to remove gallstones. His recovery seemed complete, and he resumed his grueling schedule, visiting fortifications on the Baltic coast. But a life of singular determination was ended by a moment of selflessness. In November 1724, Peter dove overboard to rescue some of his soldiers trapped on a sinking ship. He caught a chill which turned to fever, returning to St. Petersburg a weakened man. His old infection took hold once more. In unbearable pain, Peter begged for absolution for his sins because of the good he tried to do for his people. On the morning of January 28, 1725, Peter slipped into a coma and died. He was buried in a tomb in his own cathedral in St. Petersburg. He was 53. What drove Peter to do what no Russian had ever done before? An engraved seal he carried everywhere bore the inscription, "I am a pupil and need to be taught." He had the humility to learn with his own hands, and the arrogance to believe he could teach a nation to abandon its past and embrace the future. The lessons from this giant man drove a giant nation forward, outward, and into a world that, as a consequence, would be changed forever. "I see him everywhere," writes one Russian. "I refuse to believe there was but one Peter, and not several. Peter the Great."